Confronted with something he couldn't control, something that had pierced through his carefully crafted facade. He hadn't been expecting the woman to react the way she did. She hadn't been afraid of him. And worse yet, she hadn't been impressed by him. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, something truly shocking happened at the wedding. The groom, standing in front of family, friends, and loved ones, did something no one could have ever imagined. It wasn't the vows that took the crowd by surprise. It wasn't the joyful tears of the bride or the heartfelt speeches. No, it was something far darker. As the ceremony was unfolding, a sudden, unexpected moment sent ripples through the room that no one could forget. The groom slapped his bride. The gasp that swept through the guests was audible, the air thick with confusion and disbelief. Was it a mistake? Was it a moment of stress or some sort of misunderstanding? No one knew, and no one dared to speak as the room froze. The bride, her face red and teary, stood in shock, her hand gently holding her cheek, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and pain. How could this happen? How could someone who promised to love and cherish their partner, no matter the circumstances, lash out in such a violent way? It felt like everything was collapsing, the weight of the situation almost too heavy to bear. The bride's family, who had been there to witness this special day, stared in disbelief. Friends who had traveled from far and wide, who had witnessed this couple's love story unfold, were left speechless. What had driven this groom to such a breaking point? But just when everyone thought things couldn't get worse, something happened that no one saw coming. The bride, standing there in shock, did something no one in the room could have anticipated, something that would change everything. As whispers and murmurs filled the air, the room fell silent again, waiting for her next move. Would she run? Would she shout or confront the man she was supposed to marry? The tension was thick, and no one knew what would happen next. Would this moment ruin the wedding forever? Could love really survive something so shocking? The groom, visibly shaken by what he had just done, seemed torn between regret and anger. His face, once full of excitement for the future, now held an expression of torment. He looked around the room, hoping for some sort of sign, anything to ease the tension that was about to explode. And then slowly he turned toward the bride, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and despair. But just as it seemed like the entire room would collapse under the weight of what had happened, the bride made a decision that no one could have expected. What she did next left everyone in the room speechless. It changed everything. Stay tuned, because what happens next might just restore your faith in love. You won't believe what the bride did after that slap, and how the story unfolds in a way that will leave you in tears. Keep watching to see the twist that no one saw coming. The silence in the room was deafening. It was as though time had frozen, and everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The guests, once full of joy and excitement for this beautiful couple, now sat motionless, their faces a mixture of disbelief, shock, and concern. The bride, standing in front of her groom, her face flushed with both hurt and confusion, was the picture of heartbreak. The air was thick with an uncomfortable tension that no one knew how to break. As the minutes dragged on, the bride didn't move a muscle. Her hands trembled slightly as they hung at her sides, and the faint sound of her breath was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence. Her gaze was locked on the groom, who stood a few feet away, his hands shaking slightly as though he was unsure of what to do next. His face was pale, and there was a look of deep regret and guilt in his eyes. But more than that, there was fear. Fear of what he had done. Fear of what might come next. Fear of losing everything. For a moment, it seemed like no one knew what to do. The officiant who had been guiding the ceremony just moments before now stood frozen, unsure of how to react. The music, which had been playing softly in the background, had stopped. The photographer, caught off guard, lowered their camera, unsure if they should capture this raw, painful moment or look away. Then the bride, still standing in her wedding dress, looked at the groom. Her eyes, which had once been filled with love, were now clouded with hurt and confusion. She took a deep breath, and for a brief second, it seemed like she might say something, something that could change everything. But then she swallowed hard, and without saying a word, she turned and walked away from the altar. The room, still stunned into silence, watched as she left the aisle, her steps slow but deliberate, though she made no effort to wipe them away. Her heart was breaking, but it was clear she was determined to hold her composure, even if it meant walking away from the man she had promised to marry. As she approached the exit, the groom snapped out of his trance. His body jerked as if to follow her, but something held him back, something deep inside that made him question everything he had ever known about love. He had just done the unthinkable. He had hit her. He had slapped the woman he was supposed to cherish for the rest of his life. What kind of man have you become? The guests sat motionless, waiting for anything to happen. They didn't know how to respond. Some were shocked into silence. Others were whispering among themselves, speculating about what had just occurred. They had never seen anything like this before, and they couldn't fathom what could have led to this moment. Meanwhile, the bride reached the door and paused. She stood there for a long moment, her back turned to the room, as though she was waiting for something. The guests, now watching her every move, hoped she would turn back. Hope was all they had left. Could she forgive him? Could they pick up the pieces and continue the day? The groom stood frozen in place, his eyes never leaving her. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as his mind raced. He had done something unforgivable. Had he just destroyed the future they had dreamed of? But then, just as quickly as she had stopped, the bride turned back toward the altar. Her eyes were still filled with tears, but her posture had shifted. There was something stronger in her now. A certain determination, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She wiped her eyes, but only briefly. Her expression was unreadable, and for a moment, it seemed like she might say something that would tear the whole room apart. And then she spoke. "I didn't come here today to be treated like this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I didn't come here to be humiliated in front of everyone I care about. But I came here because I believed in us. I believed in what we had. And I still want to believe that the man I'm supposed to marry can be the man I fell in love with." The groom's heart sank as her words cut through him like a knife. He could barely breathe. His hands trembled as he took a step toward her, but she raised a hand to stop him. She didn't want him near her, not yet. Not after what had just happened. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need space. I need time to figure out what this all means. And I need you to understand that what you did, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal." The words stung, but the groom stood still, unable to speak. There was nothing he could say that would fix this. How could he justify what he had done? How could he explain the rush of emotions, the stress of the day, the pressure of the situation? It didn't matter. There was no excuse for what he had done. As the bride turned and walked out of the room, the groom collapsed into a chair. His face was buried in his hands as he struggled to process what had just happened. He could hear the murmurs of the guests around him, their voices filled with shock and sympathy, but none of it mattered. All that mattered now was the woman he had just hurt. The woman he loved more than anything in this world. And he didn't know if he would ever be able to fix what he had broken. The ceremony was over, but the future was uncertain. Would they ever get past this? Could they? Or had one single moment destroyed everything they had built together? As the guests slowly began to file out of the room, the groom remained seated, lost in his thoughts. The day that was supposed to be filled with joy, love, and promises of a lifetime together had turned into something no one could have anticipated. And the worst part was, they still didn't know what would happen next. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Stay tuned to see if this couple can find a way to heal and rebuild their relationship, or if the damage done will be too much to overcome. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat. The days that followed the wedding were long and painful for both of them. The groom, whose name was Michael, found himself trapped in his own mind, replaying the incident over and over again. He couldn't escape the image of her tear-streaked face, the shock in her eyes, the way she had walked away from him without a second glance. It haunted him at every waking moment. He had never felt so lost in his entire life. The phone calls he tried to make to her went unanswered. He sent texts, but they were met with nothing but silence. He reached out to her family, hoping for some kind of connection, some way to explain himself. But they too seemed to avoid him. He couldn't understand why he had let his emotions spiral out of control that day. What had driven him to lash out? How could he have let something so foolish destroy everything they had worked for? Meanwhile, Emily, the bride, was a mix of emotions. She had told herself she wouldn't let her heart rule her decision, but it was harder than she had imagined. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the man she was supposed to marry, the man she thought she knew so well. But now she wasn't sure who he was anymore. The trust that she had placed in him felt like it had been shattered in an instant. She had never imagined that their wedding day would end like this, and now she wasn't sure where they could go from here. Her friends and family, though supportive, were growing concerned. They wanted to know what was happening, wanted answers. But Emily didn't have any. She had spent the past few days at her childhood home, trying to find some clarity in the confusion that had taken over her mind. It wasn't just about the slap, it was the way he had looked at her afterward, like he was just as lost as she was. There was something deeper there, something unspoken that troubled her more than anything else. Her mother, always the calm and level-headed one, had sat with her for hours, trying to get Emily to open up. "Honey, I know you're hurting," her mother had said gently. "But you need to think about what this really means. It's not just about the slap. It's about what led to it. What's really going on in his heart." Emily had no answers. She had always believed in Michael, believed in their love. But how could she trust him now? How could she believe that a man who could hit her, even in the heat of the moment, could ever be the man she thought he was? Her friends, though more supportive, weren't much help. Some of them said he deserved a second chance. Others believed that what he had done was unforgivable. Emily couldn't blame them for their opinions. She had no idea what to think herself. She had always been the romantic one, the one who believed in happy endings, in the idea that love could conquer all. But now, sitting in the quiet of her childhood room, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Michael couldn't stand it any longer. He couldn't bear the emptiness that had settled in his life, the weight of the guilt that weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. He knew he had to see her. He had to try, even if she didn't want him to. He owed her that much. But the question was, what could he say? What could he possibly say that would undo the damage he had done? He decided to visit her, even though he wasn't sure how it would go. He drove to her parents' house one afternoon, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed what he was going to say 100 times, but now sitting in the car, he found himself blanking. There were no words that could make up for what he had done. He wasn't sure if anything would ever be enough. When he arrived, her mother answered the door, her face expressionless. Michael could see the disappointment in her eyes, the same disappointment that had reflected in the eyes of everyone else when they had heard what had happened at the wedding. "Is Emily here?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her mother didn't respond at first. She just stood there looking at him, as if deciding whether or not to let him in. Finally, she stepped aside, giving him a small nod. "She's in the living room," she said, her tone cold. "But don't expect her to talk to you." Michael nodded, his throat tight, and stepped into the house. He felt as though the walls were closing in on him with each step. He could feel the weight of the situation, the weight of the wrong he had done, pressing on him, making it almost impossible to breathe. When he entered the living room, Emily was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face turned away from him. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. He could feel the anger, the hurt, radiating off of her. And even though she hadn't said a word yet, Michael knew that everything he had been dreading was about to come crashing down. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." She didn't respond, but Michael could see her shoulders tense up. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please just listen. I don't know what happened. I don't know why I did what I did, but it wasn't you. It was me. I'm broken, and I've been carrying so much guilt for so long. I let it all out at the worst possible moment." There was still no response, and the silence between them grew thicker. "I need you to understand that I love you," Michael continued, his voice shaking now. "I've always loved you, and I never wanted to hurt you. But I've made a terrible mistake, and I don't know if there's any way to fix it. But I want to try. I want to fight for us." Emily finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and her lips quivered as she spoke. "How can I believe you? How can I trust that this won't happen again?" Michael was silent for a moment. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. He only knew that he would do whatever it took to make things right. But as he looked into her eyes, the same fear and uncertainty that had plagued him from the very beginning washed over him again. Would she ever be able to forgive him? Would they ever get back to the love they once shared? The room was heavy with the silence that hung between them. Emily sat, her eyes searching Michael's face, trying to read the man who had once been the center of her world. But now, everything about him seemed different. There was a desperation in his eyes, a brokenness that mirrored her own. He had said that he was sorry, but the truth was, she wasn't sure if words could ever undo what had happened. How could they? How could anyone fix the kind of pain that lingered after betrayal? Michael shifted uneasily in his seat, his every breath filled with the weight of the situation. He knew that every word he said, every gesture, every move was now being scrutinized by her family, by everyone who had witnessed his shame. He could feel the world pressing in on him. The pressure of the guilt, the longing to make things right, building inside him until it threatened to consume him. But what could he possibly do to prove that he was sorry? What could he say to erase the moment he slapped her, to make it so she would look at him with love again and not just with pain and distrust? "I can't just forget what happened, Michael," Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I can't pretend it didn't happen. It feels like it's always going to be there, hanging over us. And I don't know if I can live with that." Her words stung, but they were honest, raw, just like everything she had been holding inside. Michael wanted to reach out, to tell her that they could fix this, that they could rebuild from the rubble of that moment. But he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. She wasn't asking for promises, she was asking for something he wasn't sure he had anymore: trust. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how it happened. I don't know what came over me. I'm sorry for what I did. But I need you to know, I love you. I love you more than anything. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Emily shook her head, her hands clenching tightly in her lap. "You understand," she whispered, the tears falling silently. "I thought we had everything. I thought we could handle anything together. But now, I don't know who I'm looking at. This isn't the person I married." The words hit him harder than any slap could. He had always believed that their love was unbreakable, that they could face anything, that nothing would tear them apart. But now, with every word she spoke, with every tear that fell from her eyes, he was seeing the distance grow between them. She wasn't just questioning him, she was questioning their whole future together. And that realization hit him like a ton of bricks. "Please, Emily," he begged, his voice cracking. "I know I've broken your heart, but I swear to you, I'll never do anything like that again. I'm willing to go to therapy, to work on myself. I'll do anything." But Emily didn't respond right away. She just sat there, her face buried in her hands, as though she were trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake her. Michael could see how much she was struggling with the decision. Her mind was torn in two. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could get past this, but something inside her was holding her back. Could she really go on with him? Could she rebuild a life with a man who had hurt her so deeply? She wasn't sure anymore. There was a long pause, and then Emily looked up at him. Her eyes were raw, her face pale, and she had clearly been crying for hours. "I need time," she said softly. "I can't just jump back into this. I need time to think, to figure out if I can forgive you. And if I can't, then I don't know what happens next." Michael's heart sank. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Every passing second felt like it was pulling them farther apart. He had hurt her in the worst possible way, and now he was watching as the love they once shared seemed to slip through his fingers like sand in the wind. "I understand," he said quietly. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here waiting. And when you're ready, I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm not the man who hurt you." As he said the words, Michael couldn't help but wonder if they were true. Could he truly change? Could he make up for the damage he had caused? He didn't have the answers, but he knew that he would never stop trying. He couldn't. Not after everything they had been through together. But the next few days were even more agonizing than the last. Emily avoided him, hiding behind walls of silence and distance. He would catch glimpses of her at family gatherings, her eyes avoiding his, her body language closed off. The love they had once shared now felt like a distant memory, something that had slipped away into the past. But Michael couldn't give up. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, and he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance to fix things. One evening, after nearly a week of agonizing silence, Michael received a call from Emily. His heart raced in his chest as he answered, not knowing what to expect. Could this be the moment? Was she ready to talk? "Michael." Emily's voice was shaky, her tone cautious. "I've been thinking a lot, and I don't know if I can forgive you yet. But there's something I need to say. We need to talk about everything, face to face." The words made Michael's stomach churn. This was the moment of truth, the moment he had been dreading and hoping for. Would they find a way back to each other? Or had this all been too much to overcome? He took a deep breath. "I'll do whatever it takes, Emily. I'll be there. Wherever you are." As the call ended, Michael's mind raced. This conversation, Whatever it was would be the turning point. It could either lead them back to healing, or it could tear them apart forever. The weight of the unknown hung over him like a storm cloud, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to face the— All froze. For a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. The noise of the coffee shop, the bustling of the other customers, it all faded away, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He looked at her, waiting for her to say something more, to clarify, to explain how this could possibly be true. But she didn't. She just sat there, her eyes locked on his, waiting for him to absorb the weight of her words. His world seemed to shift again, this time more violently, as the reality of what she had just said settled in. A child, their child. The idea was enough to leave him breathless, but there was no escaping it now. Everything had changed, and with that one revelation, Michael realized that the stakes had just been raised higher than he ever could have imagined. Now, it wasn't just about saving their relationship. It was about saving the future they had unknowingly created. The pressure on him to make things right, to fix everything, to undo the damage, was greater than ever before. But the question lingered in his mind. Was it even possible? The story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And as Michael sat there, staring at Emily, he knew that the hardest part of this journey was still to come. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Michael had ever felt. He didn't know how to process the news. Emily was pregnant. He had thought that the stakes were high before, but now, it was impossible to ignore the crushing weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. Their future, the future of their unborn child, rested on his next steps. Everything that had been broken, all the painful memories of betrayal, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what was now at stake. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them spoke. Michael tried to gather his thoughts, but everything was spinning. A child. Their child. He had always imagined a life with Emily, but never like this. Never with the pieces of their relationship in such disarray. Never with this looming question of whether they could even survive what had already happened. "I didn't know how to tell you," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I've been so scared, Michael. Scared of everything falling apart before I even got the chance to tell you." Michael reached across the table, his hands shaking as they closed around hers. "I'm here. I'm with you. I'll be with you through all of this." He didn't know what he was promising. The words felt like the only thing he could say. He had made mistakes, huge, unforgivable mistakes. But this was something different. This was their future, their child. He couldn't run from that, no matter how broken their relationship seemed. But just as the weight of that responsibility began to settle into his chest, Emily pulled her hands away, her eyes distant again. "There's something else," she said quietly. Michael's heart stilled. He felt a sharp pang of fear, the kind of fear that could only come when you were about to hear something that could change everything again. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes flickering nervously. "I went to the doctor last week. I thought I was just stressed, but I wanted to make sure. And they did some tests." She hesitated, and Michael could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt. "Michael, I'm not the only one who's been hiding something from you." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, already dreading the answer. Emily's voice broke as she continued, her words barely a breath. "I'm not pregnant, Michael." For a moment, Michael didn't register what she had said. His mind scrambled to make sense of her words, to understand the full weight of what was happening. But then it hit him. The world spun, the floor beneath him felt like it was tilting. He stared at Emily in disbelief, unable to find his voice. "I'm not pregnant," she repeated, her voice cracking under the strain of what she had to say. "The tests were false. I'm not pregnant, Michael. I wasn't ever pregnant." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to scream, to rage against the cruel twist of fate that had brought them to this point. How could she have done this? What had driven her to tell him something that wasn't true, to trap him with such a heavy burden? He felt a wave of anger flood through him, but it was quickly followed by confusion, by a sense of betrayal that went deeper than anything he had ever imagined. "Why? Why would you say that?" His voice trembled with hurt. "Why would you lie to me like that, Emily? You had me. You had me thinking everything was on the line. I was trying to fix things because I thought we had a future. I thought we had a family. Why would you do this? The words hung in the air, and Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't the conversation he had expected. This wasn't what he had been preparing for. He had thought they were going to talk about the slap, about forgiveness, about moving on. But now, Emily was telling him that their relationship, everything they had built together, might not even be worth saving. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words failed him. How could he argue with her? He knew deep down that she was right. Their relationship hadn't been the same for a long time. They had stopped communicating, stopped being honest with each other. The love they had once shared seemed to be slipping away, and neither of them had done anything to stop it. I don't know what to do with all of this, Michael finally said, his voice barely audible. I've been so focused on what I did wrong, I didn't even realize we were falling apart in other ways. I don't know if I can fix this, Emily. I don't know how to fix us. Emily looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. I don't know if I can fix it either, she said softly. I don't know if we even can. The silence between them stretched on, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. And just when Michael thought he couldn't take the tension any longer, Emily spoke again. I'm pregnant, Michael, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mitcha. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she met his gaze, and for the first time Michael saw the fear and shame that had been eating at her. I don't know. I don't know why I did it. I was scared, Michael. I was scared of losing you. I thought if I told you I was pregnant, it would give us something to fight for. It would make you stay. Michael's mind was racing, struggling to understand. Everything she had said, everything they had talked about in the past few days. It had all been based on a lie. A lie that had twisted the entire situation into something unrecognizable. His heart pounded in his chest, anger and confusion mixing together in a blur of emotions. Emily, he whispered, his voice shaking. I thought you wanted to fix this. I thought you wanted to get past everything we've been through. But now, I don't know who you are anymore. You lied to me. You manipulated me. I never wanted to hurt you, Emily pleaded, her voice raw with emotion. I thought that if I could just make you stay, if I could make you care enough, I could fix everything. I didn't want to lose you. I was too afraid. The truth hit Michael like a slap in the face. He had been so focused on repairing the damage between them, on saving what he thought was their future, that he had never stopped to ask the right questions. Never stopped to wonder why things felt off, why Emily seemed so distant. He had been chasing a version of their relationship that didn't exist anymore. And now, as the reality of her deception settled in, he realized that he had been living in a world of half-truths, trying to fix something that might have been beyond saving all along. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Michael didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the mess they had created. His mind kept going back to the moment she had told him about the pregnancy. The rawness of her emotions, the pleading in her voice, all of it had been a lie. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about her, about them, shattered. I don't think I can do this anymore, Emily, Michael said quietly, the words coming out like a whisper. I can't keep living in this illusion. I need the truth. I need honesty, not lies. Emily's face crumpled, and for the first time, Michael saw the depth of her regret. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for it to go this far. The truth was out. The betrayal was exposed. But even as Michael sat there, staring at the woman he had once loved, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He couldn't fix the past, couldn't undo what had been done. But he could choose how to move forward. And in that moment, he knew that the hardest thing was not facing the end of their relationship, but accepting that sometimes the only way forward was to walk away. With a final look, Michael stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Goodbye, Emily, he said softly, turning and walking out of the coffee shop, leaving the tangled web of lies and regrets behind him. As the door closed behind him, Michael stepped into the cool air, the weight of the truth settling over him. It wasn't the ending he had hoped for, but it was the one he had needed. Michael walked through the city streets, the cool air biting at his skin as he tried to wrap his head around everything that had just happened. The moment he stepped out of the coffee shop, he felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he didn't know what was next. Emily's words echoed in his mind, a mix of anger, confusion, and hurt, but there was something else too, clarity. He knew he had made the right decision to walk away, but it didn't make the ache in his chest go away. As he walked, the familiar sights of the city seemed distant, almost foreign. The world felt like it had changed in an instant, and for the first time, Michael understood just how fragile everything could be. He had spent so much time trying to hold on to something that wasn't real, trying to fix a relationship that had already fallen apart. And now, with Emily's betrayal laid bare, he had no choice but to face the truth. He found himself at the edge of a park, where the quiet of the trees and the soft rustling of the leaves gave him a moment of peace. He sat on a bench, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of everything. He thought back to the days before the wedding, before everything went wrong, when he and Emily had been happy. It felt like another lifetime, another version of himself. How had they gotten here? Where had they gone wrong? It wasn't an easy question to answer. The lies, the manipulation, the silence that had settled between them for so long, it was all part of a larger picture that had been slowly unraveling. Michael realized, with a twinge of guilt, that he had been part of it too. He had let things slide, had avoided confronting the issues that had festered beneath the surface, but Emily's lie, the one that had hit him like a punch in the gut, was the breaking point. It was the moment that forced him to see that the relationship they had was beyond repair. The hardest part, he knew, wasn't accepting the end of their relationship. It was acknowledging that sometimes, no matter how much you want something to work, you can't force it. You can't build a future on lies, no matter how much you wish you could. And while he still loved Emily, he understood that love wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing that it was a message from his best friend Jake. He had been a constant support through the roller coaster of his relationship with Emily, always there to listen and offer advice, even when Michael didn't want to hear it. Jake's message was simple, yet it carried a weight that Michael felt deep in his bones. "You okay, man?" He stared at the screen for a moment, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to shut down, to ignore everything and let himself drown in his thoughts. But another part of him knew that he couldn't do that. He couldn't hide from the truth anymore, not when it mattered the most. He typed back a quick reply. "Yeah. I'm okay. I think I finally get it. Time to move on." His phone buzzed again, almost immediately. Jake's reply came in just a few seconds. "Good, you deserve to be happy, bro. You'll get through this." Michael smiled at the message, a small flicker of hope kindling inside him. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be days when the pain would feel overwhelming, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had people who cared about him, and in time he would heal. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but it was his to walk, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. As the days passed, Michael threw himself into work, focusing on the tasks that needed to be done, keeping his mind busy so he didn't have to think too much about the past. There were moments when the memories of Emily crept in, but he reminded himself that he had made the right choice. The relationship had been toxic, built on a foundation of lies and unspoken resentment. He had done everything he could to fix it, but sometimes things just couldn't be fixed. One evening, about a month after his conversation with Emily, Michael sat down with Jake at their usual spot in a local pub. The conversation was light at first, but as the night wore on, it turned more serious. "Do you think you'll ever trust again?" Jake asked, his voice thoughtful. Michael paused, taking a sip of his drink as he thought about it. Trust. It was a fragile thing. "I don't know. I think it'll take time, but I'm not in any rush. I've learned that I need to trust myself first. I have to be okay with me before I can even think about trusting anyone else." Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You've been through a lot, man. But you're stronger than you realize, and you'll come out of this better." Michael smiled, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. It was moments like these that reminded him of the importance of the people who cared about him, the ones who helped him see the light even when things seemed darkest. Weeks passed, and Michael slowly started to rebuild his life. He spent more time with friends, reconnected with old hobbies, and focused on the things that made him happy. And as he did, he found that the pain of his past began to fade. It wasn't that he forgot about Emily or what they had gone through, but he began to see it for what it was, a chapter in his life that had come to an end. And while it had been painful, it had also taught him valuable lessons. He learned that love wasn't enough to hold a relationship together. He learned that honesty and trust were the foundation of everything, And most importantly, he learned that sometimes letting go was the best thing you could do for yourself. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, looking out the window at the city lights, Michael felt a sense of peace wash over him. The past no longer controlled him. He was free to move forward, to write the next chapter of his life. The pain of the past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. In the end, Michael realized that the most important relationship he needed to nurture was the one with himself. And as he looked ahead, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready.